Hi, this is DoNotCiv, and it's Earth Day 2012, Sunday, April 22nd, 2012. And I believe, if I've done the math right, this is the 43rd anniversary of Earth Day. First Earth Day was in 1970, and there was a lot going on to drive that event. So I think what I'll start out with this clip from the CBS Evening News anchored by Walter Cronkite. So let's watch this and then I'll talk about it in just a second. Thanks.
This planet is threatened with destruction, and we who live in it with death. The heavens reek, the waters below are foul, children die in infancy, and we and the world, which is our home, live on the brink of nuclear annihilation. We are in a crisis of survival.
This is a CBS News special, Earth Day, a question of survival, with CBS News correspondent Walter Cronkite.
Good evening. A unique day in American history is ending, a day set aside for a nationwide outpouring of mankind seeking its own survival. Earth Day, a day dedicated to enlisting all the citizens of a bountiful country in the common cause of saving life from the deadly byproducts of that bounty, the fouled skies, the filthy waters, the littered earth. As a demonstration, its success was mixed, beyond expectations here, far below there. No one now can know exactly how many took part. We do have an idea how many planned participation, student groups in 2,000 colleges and 10,000 lower schools, citizen groups in 2,000 communities. By one measurement, Earth Day failed. It did not unite. It did attract that broad cross-section of America its sponsors wanted, not quite. Its demonstrators were predominantly young, predominantly white, predominantly anti-Nixon. Often its protests appeared frivolous, its protesters curiously carefree. Yet the gravity of the message of Earth Day still came through. Act or die. We begin our report with Bruce Morton in Denver.
Place for Purple Mountain's majesty. A place where, on a clear day, the legend says you could see forever. The clear days are fewer now, and instead of forever, the view often stops with haze. Next to Los Angeles, Denver has the best climate in the country for producing smog. In this unlikely seeming place, the air is threatened. Earth Day is a focus for efforts to save it.
Bicycles at the state capitol were a Denver symbol. Auto pollution is a major problem here in the country's 17th most polluted city, so high schoolers pedal to show there's another way to travel. The altitude increases car engines' pollution output. It doesn't do a thing to bikes. Somebody in the cheerful, disorganized crowd said, "Let's clean up," and the several hundred young people did, scouring the Capitol grounds for litter. Cleanups like this went on in many parts of Denver today. Somebody got a wastebasket from the Capitol and said it must be the only one, but there were enough paper bags to go around. Then they left for the teach-in, bikers on bikes, but hundreds of others traveling on foot. Some sang, some shouted, all seemed to enjoy the day. High schools were not closed, but many announced absences would be excused. Corrigan Plaza, the hall, was arranged to seat 6,000, though some planners predicted a half-full house. In fact, it was better than that. Lots of coming and going, but about 5,000 seats filled. Most were young, but not all. Most were white, but not all. A group who'd bicycled across the state gave Governor John Love a declaration supporting a cleaner planet, and the governor signed it.
So it's amazing, isn't it, after watching that clip, the sense of urgency and the sense of immediacy, which I think was rather impartially conveyed by Walter Cronkite himself, one of the great 20th century journalists. It's amazing how much has changed and how little has changed, as the French say, and I'm sorry for my horrible French, but plus c'est la change, plus c'est la même change. The more that things change, the more they stay the same. And yeah, it's amazing. The same arguments that were being made back then are the exact same arguments being made now. So it does make you wonder, are we just, walking Are we just spinning the hamster wheel here, walking the endless treadmill? I mean, it seems that the mentality hasn't changed. The lines of division, the split and schisms in societies are pretty much the same now as they were then. There are people who get it. There are people who didn't get it back then and haven't gotten it since then and still don't get it. So, anyway, I'm not trying to be too defeatist here. We're talking about Earth Day and a concomitant movement, Greenpeace. Now, it's interesting. Greenpeace came from a movement associated with nuclear weapons testing, and let me see if I can find it here in my notes. It was part of. It came about during the period of 1971 and 1972, and there was a military operation, atomic energy, administered by the Atomic Energy Commission, called Operation Grommet. And they set off quite a few weapons during Operation Grommet. Most of them were low yield, nominal Hiroshima-style yields of about 20 kilotons. A few higher, a few around the 80 kiloton range. But one giant that was in excess of 5 megatons that was set off in the chain of the Aleutian Islands on an island called Amchitka. And this particular test was called Project Kannakin, and it was part of the larger Operation Grommet, as I've said. Now, what you're looking at right now is some declassified footage of the Kannakin test. And this was a test of the Spartan missile warhead, which was it was a missile designed to take out not just a bomber, but an entire squadron of bombers. That was its purpose, and not surprisingly, it had very high yield, up in the 5 megaton range. So this was a test of that warhead. They drilled down to about 6,000 feet. They excavated a sphere, approximately, I don't know, I think it was about 60 feet in diameter, and then the warhead was detonated right at the center of the sphere. And as far as I know, there was no radiation leaks at the time. There was no measurable radiation leaks. Greenpeace claims to have found some leaks of plutonium and other isotopes when they did a sampling in 1996. The site is set to be surveyed and monitored by the Atomic Energy Commission all the way to the year 2025, at which point it'll become a national wildlife preserve, if it isn't already in principle, if not in name. So why so much focus on this event? Because this was the triggering event for it was. You got to understand the social mood in the country at the time, and I was just a small child, so I can't claim to remember it. But looking back through the historical records, and there are some things I do remember, like people just being frightened and scared and fed up with the industrial pollution pouring into America's rivers and lakes. There's one commercial that I can remember, sort of a public service advertisement featuring an American Indian. He actually was a man of Italian descent, but he was portrayed as an American Indian, and he had a tear coming out of his eyes. And I forget what the tagline was on that commercial. It's been many years since I've seen it. But it was this crying Indian, and he would look out over, the trash-strewn suburbs and freeways, and he was obviously distraught. So that was a commercial that anybody who was around at that point in history remembers that commercial. Even if you were a child, I think you remember that commercial. There was also, there was a book, there were a number of books by people like Paul Ehrlich, who wrote The Population Bomb, and then there was a seminal work by Rachel Carson, who wrote Silent Spring about the deleterious effects of DDT. And people were learning that there were all kinds of deformities in birds and their young. There were thin eggshells. There were young that were being deformed. Birds with, 3 webbed feet. Fish with multiple eyes. And this was spoofed. I don't know if you ever saw there was a Simpsons episode where this was spoofed, where Burns, who headed the nuclear plant, was forced to eat a 3-eyed fish. So this was really making an impression upon Americans at the time. Oh, and of course there were, what really drove this is there were a lot of birth defects in human beings. A lot of birth defects. And the scientific evidence pointed to the fact that this was due to the spraying of DDT and other pesticides and herbicides in the environment, and that it was being taken up in the food chain and transmitted to humans and was resulting in all these horrific birth defects. So DDT, although it was a very effective insecticide, was eventually banned due to its strong carcinogenic effects. And a lot of that can be credited to this book, Silent Spring, by Rachel Carson. Paul Ehrlich wrote the book, The Population Bomb, and he talked about, the threats of overpopulation and pollution, among others. So this was really starting to penetrate into the public consciousness. Another example, sort of an anecdotal example, was, I was talking about how polluted the rivers and lakes were. Well, there was a river in Ohio that was so polluted it actually caught fire. It was called the Cuyahoga River, and Randy Newman wrote a song about it called Burn On in his album Sail Away, which I think came out in 1972, and it rose pretty high on the Billboard. I think it was in the low 20s. It rose pretty high up on the Billboard 100 list of albums, and a lot of people I knew later, like I said, I was very young at the time this was all happening, but I know, speaking with some older co-workers and friends, a lot of people had this album, and it was a well-known song, and all these ideas and news stories, this horrific ecocidal impact that humanity was having on the environment, this was starting to gestate in human consciousness, and people were becoming more and more concerned, more and more alarmed by all this. And now I'm talking about a very short time frame here, 1969 to 1972. That's when this was all happening. The river catching fire, the Cuyahoga River catching fire, the first Earth Day, the release of the books, The Population Bomb, and Silent Spring by Paul Ehrlich and Rachel Carson, and the Cannikin test. This was, I'll characterize it as the straw that broke the camel's back. Everybody just finally, put their foot down and said, okay, enough. This test, which was, as I said, of a 5-megaton warhead, part of a larger Operation Grommet, in some cases lifted the land upwards of 5 or even 6 meters, right? And this was part of a trilogy of tests. I think the second one was Milrow, and the first one was Longshot. Longshot was just a small-sized weapon. I don't have the yield here in front of me. Milrow was a fairly large weapon. It was about 1.2 megaton yield, but Cannikin was huge. 5-megaton weapon, buried over a mile underground. And tell you what, I think this video clip that I'll play here really does justice to it. So why don't we watch this, and then I'll come back and we'll pick up with Earth Day and Greenpeace. So pretty dramatic. Yeah, I mean, just seeing large, seeing these large mobile home units just tossed about like toys. The land rising upward 5 or 6 meters, cliffs collapsing. I forget how many, I'm not sure if it was seals or sea otters. I probably shouldn't comment, but, oh, here it is. 700 to 2,000 sea otters were killed by overpressures. That's when the hydrostatic shock wave moves out from the point of detonation. It creates what's called overpressure. So it killed, anywhere from 1,000 to 2,000 sea otters. It also can rip the wings off bombers. It's quite strong. It can do other things. It can crush internal organs. You've all seen the clips from Terminator 2, etc. So you know what I'm talking about. So that event, that Kaneken event, is what gave birth to the organization that today we know as Greenpeace. It came about, it was first known as the Don't Make a Wave Committee, and it was headquartered in Vancouver. And at one of the conclusion of one of their meetings, let's see, I don't know if it was the president at the time. Let's see who said this. It doesn't say who said this. It says one man gave the traditional farewell of the peace activist movement. Peace, right? Peace sign. And then he followed it up with "Make it a green peace," replied another member. So that was it. The committee would later become Greenpeace. And this all happened as a result of that Kaneken test. And people were so outraged by this physical violence done to the planet that they said, enough, something has to be done about it. And thus Greenpeace was born. So fast forward through the rest of the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s. I mean, it's hard to believe that, 43 years have elapsed since that first Earth Day, but a lot has happened, and at the same time, nothing has happened. We're still subject to the same biases. Now, when I talk about biases, I'm talking about three in particular. I'm talking about normalcy bias, the idea that what we see happening today in our normal, everyday, day-to-day surroundings, the run-of-the-mill reality that we are exposed to, that's going to be the same reality we're exposed to tomorrow, the normalcy bias. And the other one would be recency bias. I put gas in my tank last month, last week, yesterday, ergo I'm going to be able to put gas in my tank tomorrow. That which we experienced most recently is a bias for what we can expect in the future. And then the big one is confirmation bias. And confirmation bias is, people on both sides are guilty of that. Confirmation bias, there's many examples of it, is when, for example, the evidence is ambiguous and can go either way, and you simply interpret it to support your particular set of facts that support your particular worldview, your particular doctrine or ideology, right? And you've heard the saying, you can make statistics mean anything you want. Well, that's an example of confirmation bias. People who take the statistics and they warp them and twist them to mean whatever they want. And as I said, people are guilty of this on both sides. So that's one example of confirmation bias. Another example of confirmation bias is when, hang on a second here. Another example of confirmation bias would be people who search out, they'll do Google searches, but they'll only cherry pick from the articles that support their point of view. For example, somebody exploring, global warming, for example, would only pick those articles which present evidence of lower highs and lower lows in terms of temperatures observed at various weather stations across the globe. What would be another example? People who researching peak oil would only pick from organizations, would only pick news stories and press releases from organizations that support their particular point of view. For instance, they might only pick from SARA, or they might only, if they go to more of an independent agency like the IEA, they'll only pick articles from the IEA that support their view of peak oil as not being an imminent cliff at the end of the plateau, but a bumpy plateau that will extend out to 2035, 2030. So there's that kind of, very, very biased, very focused, cherry-picking selection of news articles and research papers that only support their point of view. So that's an example of confirmation bias. And that's been pretty evident in these environmental arguments on both sides, right? So we have these biases, various types of biases that I think, to put it mildly, are really clouding the debate. It's when somebody has these kind of biases embedded in their arguments, it's a Herculean effort to tease it all apart and to get to the root core argument. No matter what their position, it's very, very difficult, which would probably explain why for more than 4 decades now, 43 years, the environmental movement is basically at a standstill. And you can say, well, we've made some progress. What about the EPA? What about all the laws? Well, all right. Where do you want to put your focus? Do you want to put your focus on laws and procedures and regulations, or do you want to put your focus on, can you go to your local creek, stream, or river, or lake, dip a cup in, and drink the water from that lake or stream? And the answer is, for 99% of us, the answer is no, you cannot. Every river, lake, stream has been polluted, including the oceans. We now have a giant toxic plume a giant toxic radioactive plume that is headed our way, headed towards the west coast from Fukushima. I think it's at Hawaii right now, if not past Hawaii. It'll be on the west coast by the end of this year, by the end of 2012. So at that point, we'll start being able to measure higher radiation levels in all the reef fish and pelagic fish up and down the west coast. Everything from rockfish to skate to lingcod to, some of the more pelagic fish like tuna and salmon and halibut. I don't know if halibut qualifies as a pelagic species or not, but it's going to be present across the biosphere. I mean, it's going to start. We'll be able to measure this in everything from sea anemones to sharks and whales and everything in between. So I don't know how you want to measure progress. If you want to measure progress in terms of, spreadsheets and data points and government regulations, that's one way to measure it. Another way to measure it is in terms of what's the overall standard of health for the environment, for the ecosphere, and I think it's very low. So all the people who are trying to ring the alarm bells, all the whistleblowers of the 1970s who've been scourged and castigated, and their reputations have been besmirched by all manner of organizations and people. Their warnings have turned out to be exactly correct. Everything that they predicted has come true, and then some. I don't think anybody Earth Day 0 in 1970 could have predicted, or would have predicted, that 43 years later we'd have a radioactive plume heading towards the west coast that's going to irradiate sections of the continent from northern Canada all the way down to central Mexico and beyond. I don't think anybody could have predicted that. I don't think anybody could or would have predicted, maybe there's a few exceptions, that, you know, we'd have a cooling pool in the fourth reactor at Fukushima that is listing, containing more than 600 tons of radioactive fuel rods, with the, I would say, you know, imminent threat that any earthquake greater than 7.0 in magnitude could fracture, rupture that cooling pool, exposing the rods to air, in which case they would catch fire, in which case you'd have the greatest disaster in nuclear disaster in the world's history. It would probably dwarf Chernobyl. I mean, that level, that amount of radioactive waste catching fire, launching, you know, plumes, giant plumes of aerosolized radioactive isotopes, including uranium and plutonium, strontium, cesium, into the atmosphere, that would basically end Japan, and it would at least shut down the entire west coast of the United States and northern Canada, at least Vancouver, for weeks. We'd probably have to go inside our homes for weeks, shut the windows, you know, duct tape Visqueen over the windows and doors, and stay inside for weeks while this plume passed over us. So those of you who want to say, well, we've made progress in the last 43 years, yeah, I would point your attention to those facts. I would point your attention to the giant garbage patch spinning around, the giant plastic gyre spinning around the Pacific Ocean, and 4 other gyres spinning around the major world's oceans. Okay, have we made progress? I don't see it. I don't see it. So lastly, I want to end this video with some thoughts on paradoxes, and I guess one in particular, and it's the so-called Jevons paradox. And what it says, the way Jevons paradox basically works. Let me wiki it while I'm talking here. Hopefully, it won't be too much of a distraction. Okay, so while that's coming up, it came up pretty fast. Jevons paradox. In economics, the Jevons paradox, sometimes called the Jevons effect, is the proposition that technological progress that increases the efficiency with which a resource is used tends to increase rather than decrease the rate of consumption of that resource. Okay, coined in 1865 by English economist William Stanley Jevons. And so this is extremely relevant to the time in which we live, because everybody is crying out for solutions. They want solutions from their activist organizations. They want solutions from local community political leaders, their city council, county commissioners, and they want solutions at the higher governmental levels, from the state and federal levels. And politicians play to this populist appeal quite a bit. More than, well, I don't want to say more than they should. They take advantage of the desire among the public to, you know, have to put forward hopeful solutions that will solve these problems and allow people to rest easy at night. And some examples that come to mind: the carbon tax that is proposed to be levied as a way to mitigate the effects of global warming, the electric car initiatives that Obama is proposing as a way to keep the happy motoring culture running in the United States as we begin to slide down the backside of the Hubbard curve and experience the effects of peak oil. Alternative energy, of course, whether it's subsidies for corn farmers in Iowa and Nebraska in order to make corn-based ethanol, a fuel which is basically a net negative in terms of EROEI, energy return on energy invested. That means you get almost, you get just a tad over the amount of energy out as you put in to grow all the corn, process it, and refine it into ethanol. Electric cars, conservation. Of course, we're all familiar now that incandescent light bulbs are being phased out in favor of these really gaudy, ugly fluorescent lights, which I don't like the type of light that's being put off by these bulbs. It's very harsh. It's very glaring. But that's where we're going. Everybody's in some countries. If it hasn't already happened, it will happen soon. Incandescent bulbs will be phased out. You'll no longer be able to buy them on the store shelves. So that is a way to cut down on power consumption. And then some more intrusive, invasive programs that have been put into effect, have been legislated by local governments, which I really don't support regardless of their beneficial effects. You've seen this in cities like Austin, Texas, and Berkeley, California, where they have mandated, there's government mandates that you have to insulate your house to a certain R value. You have to put in double pane windows, put those insulating strips around the door to prevent air from leaking in or out. And then on top of that, mandating that people have to upgrade all the appliances in their house to smart green appliances. Some of the people are even being forced to, re-insulate their attics, reshingle their roofs. And this is obviously it's a huge expense for a homeowner, and a lot of people who are retirees on fixed incomes, they just simply can't afford to do this, but they're not being granted any slack by these very hardliner city councils. And then there's, of course, smart meters. If you haven't heard about that, that's these digital smart meters that record your power consumption. You say, well, how's that any different from a regular, old-fashioned analog meter? Well, these meters can be controlled remotely. In some cities, along with the requirement to remove all your old appliances and replace them with smart appliances, they're also changing out your thermostats, and they'll be able to regulate the temperature at which you either heat or cool your house. And in the event of brownouts, which we've had in California, and which I know they've had rolling brownouts and blackouts in other states like Texas, in emergencies, they'll be able to tell you how cool you can keep your house in the summertime. For some people, that might be at an acceptable level. For the elderly, people in their 80s and 90s, maybe they put the temperature at 85, I don't know. And you can't cool your house below 85. But, pose a health threat to some people. And I see this as a very real possibility. I mean, it's not a possibility, it's an actuality. I mean, they already have thermostats that can be remotely controlled from a central power distributor. So all these things are designed for the greater good, and I didn't go into solar panels and windmills and all the other alternative technologies. All these are designed to reduce our energy consumption, but how this ties back in with Jevons paradox is, it turns out the more efficient you are at using energy, the more of that energy gets used and the faster it gets used. And you can kind of see this in the psychology of the peak oil deniers and the global warming deniers. I mean, where they see open land that isn't being used, they think, oh, well, that's the potential is there to put houses and subdivisions and people on that land. You know, that's the only way they look at it. Every square foot of open land is a potential resource to be exploited, right? Every tree, every river, every square meter of forest or mountainside or ocean is just, you know, a patch of the biosphere to be exploited for humankind, the dominant species. So what this efficiency that would result from implementation of all this alternative energy, all these energy saving measures, conservation, etc., I think, you know, apropos of Jevons paradox, all it would do would be to whet the appetite of the expansionists, the natalists, the people who think 7 billion people on the earth is good, 9 billion better, 12 billion better yet, right? These people who say, well, you can put everybody in the state of Texas, plenty of room left over. Yeah, and they'd be dead in a week. These are the people who would largely, you know, be the mechanism whereby Jevons paradox would manifest itself. All these people who, when they see a little bit extra resources, you know, they want to go use those resources. They want to either chop the trees down or burn the fuel up in the gas tanks or build more tall glassy skyscrapers or more subdivisions or more iPod, you know, techno gadgets, whatever. They want to use those resources up. You know, it's the reason why even when we had the relative prosperity of the greatest bull market in history, the last wave of it in the early 2000s, and states were running a surplus, not one dime was ever saved. Not one dime. You know, it was spent immediately, leaving no rainy day fund for the rainy day that we're in now. Okay. So those are the three things I wanted to talk about. I'm gonna wrap this up. I just want to talk about the origins of Earth Day and Greenpeace. I wanted to talk about some of the innate cognitive biases that human beings have: recency bias, normalcy bias, and then the most perfidious one is confirmation bias. That's the one that really creates the most misleading and illogical, and it's the one, yeah, it creates the most misleading, illogical arguments, and it's the one that kind of allows people to go on believing in irrational points of view. It makes them more confident in their beliefs and their belief systems, right? More willing to dig in their feet. So those biases. And then finally, the paradoxes of this movement, that the conservation movement, the green movement, will ironically create efficiencies, I grant that, but which will lead to Jevons paradox and ironically lead to a greater depletion of resources and at a faster rate. Okay. That's it for this video. Thanks for listening.